Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You know how some families hold on to tradition like it's the only thing keeping them from collapsing? Ours was like that. Christmas dinners at our house weren't just a meal, they were a performance. Polished silverware, linen napkins folded into swans, my mother's famous cranberry sauce that nobody actually liked but always complimented, my father at the head of the table, like some half-baked king in a Midwestern kingdom of passive-aggressive smiles and overcooked ham. Every year, the same jokes, the same toasts, the same little digs dressed up as just teasing. Except this year, they decided to make it memorable. We were halfway through the second round of wine when my dad stood up and tapped his glass with the back of a knife. I knew something was off immediately. He wasn't the toast type, unless it was about his latest investment or Josh's promotion. He cleared his throat, gave a small nod to my mother, who suddenly looked like someone had just pulled the oxygen out of the room, and said, in the most clipped, business-like tone I've ever heard from him, "Rachel, it's time. We've decided you're on your own now. You need to pack your things and leave by the end of the weekend." At first, I actually thought he was joking. I waited for a smirk, a punchline, something to soften the blow, but it didn't come, just silence. The kind that makes the ticking of the clock on the dining room wall sound like it's hammering nails into a coffin. Josh's fork paused midair. Aunt Carol blinked like someone slapped her across the face. My cousins exchanged confused glances. And my mother, God, she just looked down at her plate, fixing her gaze somewhere between the mashed potatoes and her shame. I didn't say a word. I didn't cry or beg or shout. I nodded once, calmly, as if he'd asked me to pass the salt. Then I stood up, pushed my chair back with deliberate quiet, and walked upstairs. Every eye followed me, but nobody said a damn thing. I could feel the weight of their stares clinging to my back like wet clothes. Upstairs, in the closet behind my old desk, buried in a locked box beneath piles of forgotten high school yearbooks and church retreat t-shirts, was a folder. I had put it together over the years, not with revenge in mind, not at first, but with that cold, gut-deep instinct you develop when something doesn't add up. When your gut tells you the people who raised you aren't telling you the whole truth. I walked back down slowly, not rushing. I could hear the murmur of conversation fade to a hush as I reached the landing. I held the folder like it was nothing more than a tax return, and as I returned to my seat, I dropped it right in front of my father. He raised an eyebrow, one of those condescending expressions he'd mastered over the years. "What's this supposed to be?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I just said, "You sure you want me gone, Dad?" He opened the folder with that same dismissive arrogance he used whenever I tried to bring up things that made him uncomfortable. Things like the money Grandma left in her will, the time I found a second life insurance policy she never mentioned, the way my mother always changed the subject when I asked why Uncle Don stopped coming around after I turned 10. The moment his eyes landed on the first page, his entire posture changed. You know when someone's body gives away the truth before their mouth can lie? That was it. His shoulders stiffened, jaw clenched, and his hand, his strong, controlling, firm as granite hand, started to tremble. Not a nervous twitch, no, a real shake, the kind you can't stop when your brain finally catches up to a fear you never thought would materialize. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice low and barely keeping it together. "I lived here, remember?" I said. "You might control the money, the narrative, the reputation, but you were never very good at locking drawers." My mother leaned forward, trying to glance at the page. When she did, her face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Just this stunned, heavy silence. Josh stood up, but he didn't say anything either. His eyes flicked between me, my dad, and the folder. He didn't know whose side to be on. Typical. That folder held 27 years of secrets, contradictions, and buried paper trails. It held copies of emails, notarized letters, an unedited version of my grandmother's will, the real one, and something else. Something they thought I'd never find. The thing that would come up in conversation soon enough. Just not yet. Let them sweat first. The table had gone from festive to funereal in under 5 minutes. You could practically feel the heat drain out of the room, replaced by the raw static of panic. I took a sip of wine, set the glass down gently, and looked my father dead in the eye. "You wanted me gone?" I said, voice flat. "Fine. But you don't get to pretend this house is clean while you're sweeping every rotting thing under the rug." "I brought the rug. I'm just flipping it over." He looked down again at the papers, flipping through them now faster, desperate. As if maybe, just maybe, he could find a mistake, a forgery, a way to say it wasn't real, but he wouldn't. Because it was all real, every word. And as I watched his hands shake, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself until that very moment. I didn't come back downstairs to ask for anything. Not pity, not understanding, not even justice. I came back to take control of a story they'd written without me. And this time, I was the one holding the pen. What would you do if your family tried to erase you from your own life? Would you let them? Or would you set the whole table on fire just to make sure they couldn't eat in peace? There's a strange kind of silence that follows an explosion, the kind that makes the walls feel closer, like the air is waiting to be filled with something. After I dropped that folder on the table and watched my father's fingers shake like he was gripping a live wire, nobody dared to speak. Aunt Carol pretended to sip her wine, though I could see her knuckles tighten around the stem like it might snap. My cousins were still trying to figure out what exactly they were witnessing, too young to grasp the full weight, but old enough to sense a shift in the room's center of gravity. My mother had her hands folded in her lap like she was at a funeral, eyes glazed, body stiff, like if she didn't move, maybe none of it would be real. But I knew exactly what was real, because I'd been building it, page by page, year by year, in a locked metal box that no one ever thought to look for, not that they would have anyway. I was always the dramatic one, the too sensitive daughter, the one they said couldn't take a joke, couldn't move on from things. They underestimated me the way people underestimate quiet women. They assume silence means weakness, when really it's just the sound of observation. It started with little things that didn't make sense but weren't quite alarming enough to confront. I was 17 the first time I saw the wrong date on a tax document. It was a line item under an old account, registered under my name, but I had never opened it. I asked my dad about it casually, like I was just curious. He told me it must have been a bank error and that I should stop snooping. That was the moment I started keeping copies. Not because I knew what I was looking for, I didn't, but because I knew something wasn't adding up. By the time I was 23, I had receipts, emails, letters, real letters from my grandmother, dated and signed, full of details that didn't match the stories I'd been told. She had written me out of love, not obligation, and she had made it very clear that I was meant to inherit the house. "It's for Rachel," she wrote. "She needs a place that can't be taken away from her." That sentence sat with me like a weight on my chest. At her funeral, my father said she left the house to both her children equally, and that it was to be sold, and the money split. That wasn't just a misunderstanding, that was a lie. One I didn't know how to fight back then, not without evidence. So I waited, and I looked, and I found what I needed. The folder held all of it in order. The altered will with its mismatched signatures and suspicious notarization date, the unexplained withdrawals from the joint account she'd shared with my mother during her last months, the email chain between my father and a lawyer discussing modifications that were conveniently never brought up to the family. And then there were the property deeds. That's what made my father's hand shake. One of them had a name on it that shouldn't have been there, a name that didn't belong to anyone in our family, and yet somehow had been used to funnel money through a shell LLC registered to an address in another state. I hadn't figured out exactly what they were doing with it, but it was enough to cause problems, real legal ones. That was just the beginning. What truly caught them off guard, though, wasn't the legal papers. It was the photos. At the back of the folder were 3 glossy, high-resolution photographs, taken just a few months earlier. One showed my father at a bank. Not ours, not the one where they held the mortgage, but a private bank with no branches in our state. Another showed him entering a building downtown that housed a law firm specializing in asset protection and estate restructuring. And the last one, that one was just a shot of him talking to a woman I'd never seen before, blonde, tall, with a Chanel bag and a watch that cost more than my car. Her hand was on his chest. He was smiling. My mother hadn't seen those yet. She was too focused on the documents in the front. I watched her flip a page and pause, her eyes narrowing. She looked up at him, and for a moment, it looked like she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Instead, she reached for her glass and drank deeply. Josh finally spoke, his voice cracking like it hadn't in years. "What the hell is this, Rachel?" I looked at him, my perfect brother, the golden child, the one who always towed the line and got rewarded for it, the one who used to tease me for being paranoid when I locked my bedroom door as a teenager, who said I needed therapy because I held on to things too long. I looked at him and smiled, not kindly. "It's the truth, Josh. I just collected it, since no one else seemed interested." He shook his head. This is crazy. You've been spying on our family? For what, revenge?" I leaned back in my chair, still calm, still holding all the weight in the room without flinching. I started collecting because I knew something wasn't right. I finished because one day I realized I wasn't going to get an apology, and I wasn't going to wait around to be erased quietly. The room sat in silence again, this time with a different kind of tension. Not fear, not shock. Something heavier, guilt maybe, or recognition, maybe even regret. My father finally stood, folder still in hand, and walked out of the dining room. My mother didn't follow. Josh didn't move. I poured myself another glass of wine and watched the bubbles rise to the surface like they were trying to escape too. And then I reached into my bag and pulled out a second envelope. This one was addressed, not to them, to someone else. A name they hadn't heard in over 2 decades. A name I hadn't said out loud since I was a child. I placed it gently on the table, right beside my mother's untouched dessert, and said nothing. Let them sit with it. Let them wonder. It's strange how your whole life can shift in the space between one breath and the next. How a name you haven't heard in years can suddenly feel like the missing puzzle piece that makes every jagged memory finally lock into place. That envelope I laid beside my mother's dessert dish, the one addressed in clean, even handwriting, sealed with the same deliberate calm I had wrapped around myself like armor all evening, bore the name of the man I'd once called Uncle Mark. To anyone else at that table, the name probably didn't mean a thing. But to my parents, it might as well have been a bomb ticking down to detonation. Uncle Mark wasn't really my uncle, of course. He was a friend of the family, or at least that's how he'd been introduced to me as a child. Always around, always polite, always just close enough to seem permanent without being explained. He used to bring me little wooden toys, hand-carved and sanded smooth, and I remembered sitting cross-legged on the living room floor while he told me stories about his travels. Stories that didn't sound like bedtime fairy tales but like real adventures, full of places I could look up on a map. When I was around 10, he disappeared from my life without warning, like someone had yanked his string out of the narrative. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. I asked my mother once where he went. I remember it vividly. I was 12, standing at the sink rinsing plates after dinner, and I casually mentioned that I missed him. Her hand jerked, a plate slipped, cracked in half in the basin, and she said far too quickly that he had moved to another country. "Long story," she said, her tone final. I never brought it up again, but I never stopped wondering either. That envelope wasn't just a message. It was proof that I had found him. And more than that, it was a statement. I wasn't asking for the truth anymore. I was dragging it into the light whether they were ready or not. My father didn't come back into the room. He'd taken the folder and disappeared upstairs, probably trying to figure out how much of what I had was legally damning and how much could be brushed off as paranoia. My mother, however, stayed seated at the table, staring at the envelope like it might bite her. Her fork hovered mid-air, untouched cheesecake beginning to sweat under the dining room lights. Josh leaned over, trying to read the name, but I tilted it slightly out of his line of sight. Not for you, I said. This one's just for her. My mother blinked, slow and deliberate, and for the first time that evening, she met my eyes. There wasn't anger there, or even fear, just exhaustion, decades of it, lined into her face like folds in a wrinkled napkin. Rachel, she said softly, you don't understand everything. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. The way people who've spent your entire life lying to you suddenly think they can earn mercy by playing the victim. That's the first true thing you've said all night, I replied. I don't understand everything, but I understand enough. She set her fork down and picked up the envelope, her hands trembling in that barely perceptible way, the same way they used to tremble when she reached for a bottle of wine before noon on particularly bad days. She didn't open it, she just held it like it weighed more than paper should. I didn't plan to tell them right then what I had discovered. Not all of it. They didn't deserve the whole story on my terms. Let them dig. Let them stew in the not knowing, the same way I had for years. But I needed Josh to hear part of it, because he was always the one who got the shiny version of our family, the polished apple, the Sunday best narrative. I turned to him slowly. You ever wonder why I never looked like either of them? I asked, tone level, almost conversational. Why my baby pictures disappeared after Grandma died? Why Dad got so weird anytime someone mentioned the year I was born? He frowned, confused, defensive, but not dismissive. What are you talking about? There's a custody affidavit in that folder, I said. Signed by Mark Reynolds. It was filed when I was 2. He tried to get visitation rights. Guess who filed against him? Josh blinked, processing. That's not possible. Mom and Dad, they're not my biological parents, I cut in. Or at least, not both. She had an affair. He found out. They tried to cover it up. Mark wanted to be involved. And they buried it. Legally, socially, and emotionally, they erased him. And by extension, erased part of me. It felt surreal saying it out loud. After years of half-suspicions and quiet shame, of wondering why I felt so disconnected from the people who raised me, why my father's disapproval always had an edge of something deeper, something more like resentment than disappointment. It all made sense now. Josh didn't speak. He just sat there, stunned, as the room spun slowly into another silence. My mother finally set the envelope down and stood up, her knees creaking slightly from years of stress and careful denial. She didn't look at me again. She didn't need to. I wasn't done, not by a long shot. But I had given them the first piece, the one that would unravel the rest of the story, whether they wanted it to or not. And the look on her face, a mixture of grief, fear, and something unspoken, told me she knew it too. I poured myself another glass of wine, leaned back in the chair that had once been my spot at every family dinner since I was 6, and let the silence stretch. I wasn't here to scream. I wasn't here to throw plates or cry or beg for understanding. I was here to unearth the truth they had buried in my name. And I was only getting started. By the time I woke up the next morning, the dining room was cleared, the wine stains had been scrubbed out of the tablecloth, and the whole house had that eerie, sterile stillness that only exists after something terrible has happened, when people pretend it hasn't, and the quiet becomes a form of denial. The Christmas decorations still blinked lazily on the banister, like some cruel joke, a reminder that this was supposed to be a time for warmth and celebration. But all I could think about was how quickly a family can fold in on itself when the lies aren't thick enough to hold the structure upright. I had stayed the night, not because I needed to, and certainly not out of sentimentality, but because I wanted to give them the gift of discomfort. Let them sit in it, let them choke on it. I could have left, but leaving would have been too clean. Instead, I made myself coffee in the kitchen I had grown up in, deliberately loud with the cabinets, letting the smell drift through the house like an announcement that I wasn't going anywhere until I had finished what I started. Josh came down first, hair still a mess, t-shirt wrinkled, face pale and drawn like he hadn't slept. He didn't say good morning, didn't ask how I was, didn't make a joke like he usually did when things got tense. He just poured himself a cup and stood there beside me, eyes staring into the black liquid like it could give him answers. "You really believe all of it, don't you?" he finally said, voice hoarse, cautious. "I don't need to believe it," I replied, not turning to look at him. "I have the documents, the emails, the proof. Belief isn't necessary when the facts are screaming." He flinched just slightly, and I caught it in my peripheral vision. That tiny crack in his armor, the realization that his role as the peacekeeper, the good son, wasn't going to work here. He had always been good at deflecting, at smoothing things over with charm and surface-level concern, but charm doesn't fix structural rot, and I wasn't in the mood for pretending any of us were okay. "I think you want to blow it all up," he said after a moment, more accusation than observation. "Not just get justice. I think you want to hurt them." That made me turn. Slowly, calmly, I met his eyes, and for once, I didn't hold back. "You think I want to hurt them? After what they've done? After they stole a life from me, rewrote my childhood, buried my real father, and made me feel like I was crazy every time I asked too many questions? You think this is about revenge, Josh?" He looked away, shame or guilt or something like it clouding his expression. "You know what the worst part is?" I continued, quieter now, but sharper. "I didn't start any of this to hurt them. I started documenting things because I was scared. I felt like I was losing my grip on what was real. You remember those years, don't you? When I started keeping to myself, locking my bedroom door, carrying that old notebook around like it was a diary. That wasn't paranoia. That was survival. I wrote everything down because they made me doubt my own memory, my own instincts." He nodded slightly but still didn't speak. That was always Josh's problem. He was just passive enough to avoid blame, just compliant enough to be excused from the hard conversations. But silence, in this family, was never neutral. It was complicity dressed up as politeness. Later that afternoon, the calls started coming in. First, it was a colleague of my father's, a man I vaguely remembered from some fundraiser years ago, calling to touch base after an anonymous packet had made its way into the legal department of the company where my father had been a board member for over a decade. Then it was someone from the church, calling my mother to ask whether the rumors were true, not just about financial misconduct, but about a moral breach, which I could only assume referred either to the hidden affair or the quietly funneled inheritance funds from my grandmother's estate. Both were true, of course. Both had receipts. My father finally emerged from upstairs that evening, haggard and silent, the proud, immovable man now carrying the posture of someone who'd been hollowed out from the inside. He didn't look at me, didn't speak. He just walked through the living room, paused like he wanted to say something, then continued toward the front door. A minute later, his car pulled out of the driveway. My mother followed not long after. She didn't ask me to stop. She didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't even argue. She simply said, in a voice devoid of fight, "You could have handled this differently." I stared at her long and hard before responding. "So could you." She didn't reply. That night, I sat alone in the living room, folders still on the table, documents splayed out like artifacts from a life I was only just beginning to reclaim. I wasn't stupid. I knew this wouldn't end cleanly. There would be backlash, retaliation, maybe even legal noise. But none of that mattered in the moment. What mattered was that the curtain had been pulled back, the performance halted, the script shredded. And yet there was one more thing. In the back of the folder, tucked behind all the evidence, was a final item I hadn't shown them yet. A copy of my grandmother's original will, notarized, time-stamped, and witnessed, which clearly named me as the sole beneficiary of the house they had lied about, sold furniture from, and mortgaged behind my back. It had always been mine. They had just counted on me never finding out. The next morning, I made a quiet call to an estate attorney and set a meeting. I didn't gloat. I didn't scream. I didn't post about it online or burn down their legacy. I simply began the process of reclaiming what was always mine. As I hung up the phone and watched the sun begin to rise through the living room window, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not joy, not satisfaction, but clarity. They wanted me gone. They made their choice. But they forgot one thing. I know how to survive. They taught me that, at least. There's a strange kind of calm that settles over you after the storm has passed. Not because everything is suddenly better or resolved, but because the worst of the screaming has ended, and you're left with the kind of quiet that feels both earned and dangerous, like standing in a burned-down house and realizing that even though everything you once knew is gone, you're still standing. I stayed in that house for 2 more days after everything came to light, not because I wanted to, not because I felt some deep emotional tether to the walls or the memories held in its corners, but because I needed to see how far the cracks would run once the facade finally collapsed under the weight of truth. They didn't come back right away. My father, as I had predicted, retreated into silence and legal consultation, no doubt trying to figure out what he could bury, what he could deny, and what, if anything, he could spin, to protect what little reputation he had left. My mother, always the more calculating of the two, went quiet on the outside, but started moving behind the scenes. I saw the calls she tried to make to distant relatives, the emails sent late at night trying to mend old bridges they had long ago burned. All of it done with the same desperation that a drowning person shows when they suddenly realize the boat they poked holes in is now sinking with them still on it. I didn't interfere. I didn't try to stop them or escalate the drama. Instead, I sat with it, calmly, methodically, going through the folder one last time, making notes, sending copies to a secure drive, and confirming that every document, every photo, every piece of evidence had been accounted for. It wasn't about revenge anymore, at least not in the bloodthirsty sense people like to imagine. It was about drawing a line in the sand that they couldn't pretend didn't exist. The truth was, I could have destroyed them completely. I had enough to ensure that neither of them could walk into a community center or a family gathering without whispers following them like shadows. I had enough to trigger audits, to bring up charges, to stain the pristine little narrative they had spent 30 years curating with forced smiles and seasonal newsletters. But I didn't unleash all of it, because as satisfying as vengeance can feel in theory, in practice it's often messy, unsatisfying, and worst of all, permanent in ways that eat into your own peace more than the person you're punishing. Instead, I made one final move. On the morning I left, I walked back into the dining room. The same one where it had all begun, where the turkey had gone cold and the cranberry sauce remained half smeared across plates no one had cleared. And I placed a second folder on the table. This one was smaller, thinner, less dramatic than the last. But what it contained was infinitely heavier. Inside it was a letter addressed to Mark Reynolds, the man who had tried once to be a father to me before he was exiled from my life with the efficiency of a guilty conscience. I had found him, not easily, but not impossible either. A man like him doesn't vanish entirely, not when he still pays property taxes and runs a woodworking business out of a small town 2 states away. I had written to him weeks before the dinner, testing the waters, trying to understand what kind of man he had become, and whether the stories I had been told about him, about instability, about abandonment, about threats, had any truth to them. What I discovered instead was something far less dramatic and infinitely more human. A man who had been heartbroken, silenced by legal threats, manipulated by people who wanted to erase his existence from my story. He had tried, in his own flawed and quiet way, to stay close, but every attempt had been blocked, every effort intercepted. The letter I left was not a plea for reconnection, nor was it a theatrical moment of forgiveness. It was an invitation, one meeting, one conversation, no promises, no expectations. Just the opportunity to look each other in the eyes and see what had been lost and what might still be reclaimed. I didn't know if he would answer, and I still don't, but writing that letter felt like giving air to a part of me that had been locked in a box since I was a child. a part that deserved a voice, even if no one ever heard it. As I zipped my suitcase and walked toward the door, I didn't look back. The house didn't deserve a sentimental goodbye. The childhood I had lived inside its walls had been edited and curated by people who needed me to play a role I never auditioned for. They needed me to be silent, obedient, grateful for being allowed to exist inside a structure built on lies and denial. But I had found something stronger than their approval. I had found clarity, and with it came the realization that walking away didn't mean weakness. It meant I finally understood my own strength. I left the keys on the counter, not because I had to. Legally, the house was now in dispute, and with the original will recovered and authenticated, the outcome was all but certain. But because I didn't need to cling to it. They could fight over the ashes if they wanted to. I wasn't interested in living inside their ruins. And yet, in the deepest part of me, I knew I would carry some of it with me. You don't grow up inside a lie without the truth leaving scars when it finally breaks through. I knew there would be moments, years from now, when I'd question whether I had gone too far, whether I had handled it with too much precision and not enough compassion. I knew there would be people, friends, extended family, acquaintances who only saw the surface, who would call me cruel, vindictive, too clever for my own good. And maybe they'd be right. Maybe I had crossed lines that shouldn't have been crossed. But maybe, just maybe, crossing those lines was the only way out. I walked down the front steps slowly, suitcase in one hand, the winter air biting against my cheeks in a way that felt clean, almost purifying. The street was quiet, the world unaware of what had just unfolded behind those walls, and I liked it that way. Let the house pretend. Let the windows smile from the outside. The truth, the real story, was mine now, and I would carry it forward not as a burden, but as a shield. They said I was on my own now, so I nodded like I had that night and whispered to no one in particular. Then let's see what I've learned.